It's good to be back in Bristol. It's good to be back at Truth Juice. And appropriately tonight, we're going to be talking about truth juices and truth biscuits and truth tabs and all varieties of truth. Okay. Tonight's talk is about psychedelic drugs. It's about entheogenic substances, and theo as in, theology, something to do with the divine, something to do with the sacred. So we're going to go right to the heart of the matter and explore what I think is the most interesting psychedelic experience. In my personal experiences, which I'll talk a little bit later on, is that there's funny patterns, and there's colors are extremely bright, and people laugh, amazing humor with psychedelic drugs, and the music's amazing, and biggest orgasms you've ever had in your life. But really, for me, the key psychedelic experience, what really interests me, apart from the amazing orgasms, is this experience of being one of the universe. So the second part of the talk, this will really concentrate on this kind of key experience called the God trip, or this experience of being one of the universe, and a lot more besides. Okay, so we're going to cover things from every single angle imaginable. But we'll start off just to put things in context. So we're going to cover a bit of history, just to put things in context. So we're going to examine the past in order to understand the present, so then we can understand the future. Okay, so I'm going to give a kind of survey of psychedelic drugs in the past. I'll try to be as comprehensive as I can, and show that really in terms of the origins of religion and even civilization, it's always been there. Okay, so this is kind of the suppressed, probably one of the most controversial subjects on there is basically, this idea of being one of the universe, and the other one is psychedelic drugs. So we're going to cover these things tonight. Okay, so a kind of basic skimming stone, but also trying to cover as much as we can in a comprehensive manner of the history of psychedelic drugs. We're going to go, right through history. So if we start from the beginning, okay, prehistory, what we have is hunter-gatherer societies. And what we had is basically people ate things, people put things in their mouths, because our caveman ancestors, sometimes there were kind of lean periods and they starved. So basically, through the course of tens, hundreds of thousands of years, absolutely everything, every plant was ingested at some point. So naturally, our hunter-gatherer ancestors would have discovered that some of these things were intoxicating, some were nourishing, some were poisonous, and you're dead. And some produced these kind of mystical states, these psychedelic states. And then, later on, you have the kind of institute of the shaman, so it becomes institutionalized. Then these plants become recognized as being psychedelic, and they become kind of, they become special and recognized as something sacred, something that's going to produce some kind of transcendent states. Now, if we go, kind of the dawning of history, Mesopotamia, the most ancient myth, the oldest story that exists, Gilgamesh, is a reference to the plant of immortality, a kind of oblique reference to psychedelic plants. But we know in Babylon, in that part of the world, Mesopotamia, mandrake and cannabinoids were used as a kind of like a sacred sacraments. So these are from cuneiform tablets. And kind of going slightly forward in history now. Ancient Egypt, very important place. We have the blue lotus of the Nile, which we know is psychedelic. We know it's a psychedelic plant. And we also have the water lily. So on Tutankhamun's tomb, when they discovered it, was scattered petals of the water lily all over his tomb. And the mandrake again, the mandrake plant, which we'll investigate later on. Get these recurring substances and recurring chemicals come again and again. And moving forwards in time, Persia, we have this Zoroastrian religion, and they talked about hooma, this kind of psychedelic sacrament used by the Zoroastrian priests, hooma. And then the diagram I saw earlier, Mithraism came from Persia, this idea that Mithras, this kind of like a pagan mystery god, this pagan mystery religion used psychedelic sacraments. And moving forwards in history even more, in ancient Greece and Rome. Now, the Lotus Eaters, not the oldest story, but the classic of classic, Odysseus. In the Iliad, the story of Odysseus, you have the first island, the first port of call is the island of the Lotus Eaters. Now again, if we know that lotus is a psychedelic plant, then what it means is that Lotus Eaters is that mythology is spiritual allegory. It's saying that basically this spiritual journey of Odysseus, or this kind of voyage, is a spiritual allegory. The first island is the island of the Lotus Eaters, a psychedelic plant. And we could speculate, is it the same lotus as the blue lotus? We could speculate, but it's plausible. Okay. And the Eleusinian Mysteries outside of Athens, we don't know exactly what the kykeon is, but they drank a brew, okay, burnt loads of incense, banging drums in a darkened space in Eleusis, a few miles from Athens, and it had this apocalypse, the unveiling of the hidden thing, a personal apocalypse where people became one with the deity, become unified with God or the transcendence. So, okay, staying with in antiquity, staying in Greece, you have the Delphic Oracle. Okay, now this is interesting because the Delphic Oracle, the prophetesses of Greece, we know now basically from ancient writings, basically they ingested gases from a hydrocarbon vent and they ingested the smoke of laurel leaves, and from that they tripped out. So in a Scientific American article, modern excavations show that the Temple of Apollo is actually built on a kind of volcanic like fault, and 2,000-3,000 years ago, kind of these gases came out of the ground, and these Delphic oracles tripped out on the gases. Now, years ago, I was living in the squat, and these kind of crusties came in. Now that squat, everyone was dodgy. Everyone was, kind of involved in petty crime. But these guys were super. You kind of put your hands in your pockets. Don't take my money. Don't take my dole check, kind of thing. And anyway, interesting guys. They talked about their experiences with butane. And I was thinking to myself, guys, I'd never stick butane up my nose and kind of suffocate my brain with butane, these hydrocarbon gases. I'd never you guys are so hardcore. That's like glue sniffing. But anyway, in antiquity, the Delphic oracles were doing exactly the same thing, and they were tripping out. Okay, now the prophetess of Rome, the Sibyl of Rome, now she lived in volcanic caves in southern Italy, and the same idea, basically she inhaled these hydrocarbon gases, and she prophesied. So again, a kind of a reference to psychedelic mind-manifesting substances or hydrocarbon gases. Now, continuing our survey, okay, going forwards in time, we have the mysteries of Mithras, but also we have these ancient mysteries of Dionysus, Orpheus, and Bacchus, etc. The idea is basically all of these mystery religions at some point involved taking certain substances to induce mystical states, especially the Mithras cult, which became Christianity, which we'll explore more in depth in our next section. Now, the Pagan Mysteries, now witchcraft. Okay, this is all pervasive all over Europe and all over the world. Basically, that people in the countryside, they took chemicals to get kind of mystical states. Now, amazingly and interestingly, in antiquity and also in medieval times, before the Inquisition and the witch hunts. Now, the witches' weeds, okay, a bit of neuroscience, the witches' weeds are your classic kind of witch substances that you taught in school not to touch, not to go, not to kind of ingest or even think about, henbane, deadly nightshade, witches' weeds. And mandrake, again, mandrake is a witch's weed, classic witch's weed. And the other one's datura. Now, amazingly, all these witches' weeds hit the same brain chemical. It actually hit the same brain receptor. It's called the muscarinic acetylcholine receptor. That's amazing, isn't it? Because muscarinic acetylcholine receptors are named after fly agaric, Amanita muscaria, which is also another psychedelic. It's basically the red mushroom with the white spots. Okay, classic psychedelic. So without any knowledge of neuroscience, these witches or pagan mystery religion devotees found a substance which hit the same brain receptor, the muscarinic acetylcholine receptor. Absolutely amazing. Okay, without any knowledge of brain receptors and the brain at all. So we can kind of see a picture of a kind of like ancient mystery religion, witchcraft, kind of shamanism, indigenous religion, and we kind of this recurring theme through kind of antiquity. Now we kind of move slightly more forwards in time to religion. Okay, so what we understand is religion now. This is more controversial because we're heading into the territory. This is a Mithraism. This is a Mithraeum, where devotees of Mithras, Roman soldiers, got together and they basically, okay, what you taught in schools is that they kind of sung hymns and meditated on Mithras. Okay, but modern scholarship tends to, more open-minded modern scholarship tends to believe that these Roman soldiers, the Mithraeum was arranged for eating. So basically that's a kind of more dressed up version. And Roman soldiers, they it's the biggest cult or religion of the Roman soldiers, Mithras. And the idea now is that basically the Roman soldiers sat and they ate psychedelic substance. And also what happened in Mithraeums was orgies. So basically Roman soldiers far away from home, what they did was they took psychedelic drugs, which are very often aphrodisiac, and then they basically had an orgy in the Mithraeum, and that's what went on there. Okay, you're not taught that in Sunday school. Okay, so but it's very controversial. Your Sunday school teacher, or if you go to church, your priest isn't going to approve of that. But this is kind of the new revised scholarship of what went on in Mithraeums. Now that sounds wild, but I mean, in Roman times, orgies were common. And Roman soldiers far away from home, basically, if this was your last ever hangout in a Mithraeum, you really went for it. And if you're intoxicated on aphrodisiac psychedelic drugs, then I think it's not just plausible, it's kind of obvious that this is actually what happened in these kind of places. And then people tripped out and they experienced being one of Mithras and become one of the deity. Okay, this is we're going to head into controversial territory now. We're going to explain now how, without exception, in all the world's religions, at the dawning of all the world's religions, is psychedelic substances. So this is where we head into controversy, because this is where the truth gets banned systematically in world religion. We're going to explain in detail how this is the case. Okay, just a quick overview of religion, world religion. Basically, these are the major religions of the world, just representing most of the people on the planet. Okay, so basically you have these outer mysteries, what people know and hate about religion, the fantasies, the fairy tales, the fables, the kind of meaningless rules, rituals, and regulations. That's what we normally understand as religion. But these inner mysteries of religion, in all religion, there's inner mysteries. And they all point to the same idea. Somehow that, okay, the outer mysteries allude to the inner mysteries, because they all talk about Allah close to you in your jugular vein. Allah is close to you than your jugular vein. The Christ within, the Krishna within, the Buddha within. But they also say in the scriptures, and also in the more kind of Gnostic banned scriptures, that somehow we're all one. Okay. That God is one. Okay, the greatest commandment in Judaism and Christianity, hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. But also somehow the idea that God is one, that God inside us is also one. In the Bhagavad Gita, the super soul, which is God inside you, the super soul appears divided, but is never divided and is always situated as one. So God is one, God inside you is one, but somehow that we're all one. In Christ there's no Jew, there's no Greek, there's no slave. For in Christ we're all one. In the Quran, that God has created us from one soul, one self. But in the surah called Luqman, there's a very esoteric passage, because it says, your creation and your resurrection is like that of a single self, not otherwise. So it kind of like, reflects that Bhagavad Gita passage. Somehow we think we're separate selves, but we're actually the same self, and it's not otherwise. So again, a bleak reference to kind of mystical truths, kind of hidden mysteries. So this idea essentially that God is one, we are one, and the experience of being one with God, that the oneness that we are, that the oneness that God is one and the same. So at the heart of religion is preserve this esoteric truth in the, in the Tantras, in Jewish Kabbalah, even to today, in Sufi sects. In Christianity, the Gnostics were largely wiped out, but even in Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism, historically, I don't know what situations today, these truths kind of were maintained. And India, to a large extent, has been maintained, and in kind of the ancient kind of Taoist texts talk about the same idea, really. Okay, now what do these religions have to do with psychedelics? Now this is where it gets interesting, because psychedelics have been systematically banned through antiquity and through history. So this is the kind of like the kind of controversial interpretation of world religion. Okay, systematically go for all of them and show, without exception, they all involved in the past psychedelic drugs. Now, okay, Hinduism, this is quite easy to deal with, because the idea that somehow we're all God, somehow God is inside us is one, is more kind of accepted. It's more common even in India today. Now, historically, the Bhagavad Gita talks about the Soma, okay, this substance that people ate the Soma and they tasted the delights of heaven, the highest heaven, basically, in the Bhagavad Gita. That's what it says. Now, Soma means to press out and extract. And there's ancient Sanskrit texts which describe the lotus plant as Soma. So at some point they were pressing out and extracting from the lotus plant. So back to Egypt and the Lotus Eaters again. So same same kind of substances come up again and again. And also in the Tantras, the use of things like datura and cannabinoids, all kind of associated with these mystical legends that datura grows out of the chest of Shiva, that a legend Shiva smokes charas for 1,000 years, a form of cannabinoid, and becomes God. So these kind of mystical allusions in Indian kind of mythology and Indian religion. And now Buddhism, people saying, what do psychedelic drugs have to do with Buddhism? Okay, to start off with, the official version of Buddha's enlightenment. This is the official version. It's not controversial to say this. That, so Buddha meditated for months and months and months, became really, really thin and emaciated, and basically, before his final enlightenment, a young girl gave him a milky substance to drink. Because this is not a controversial thing to say, just basically the standard story. And he drank the milky drink, felt refreshed, then shortly after he had his enlightenment. Now, in this context, with kind of progressive, open-minded people, it's kind of obvious what happened. Young girl going, Buddha, that Buddha guy's been meditating for such a long time, he hasn't had his enlightenment yet. You know, poor bastard, I put him out of his misery. Here, Buddha, have a tab. And then bang, well, literally bang, bang. Literally, the substance is bang. You can get in India today. It's a weak cannabinoid. And then Buddha had his enlightenment. I'm not saying it was only the bang or only the milky substance, but I'm saying a man of his caliber, all that meditation together with that milky cannabinoid substance is enough to trigger his final enlightenment. Now, that sounds like, in some circles, that would be seen as the most controversial, obscene thing to say, but it's kind of obvious, isn't it? Completely obvious. Staying with Buddhism, Padmasambhava is the saint that brought Tantric Buddhism from India to Tibet. Padmasambhava means lotus born. Lotus, again, lotus plant. Now, what does it mean? The legend has it that he basically came down on a big lotus as a great big baby. That's the legend, that's the myth. What it literally means is that in the tantras in India, they use psychedelic plants like lotus, Soma, press out extract, datura, and cannabinoids. So lotus born means in the same way that many kind of spiritual aspirants from the 60s, 70s, and myself were lotus born in the sense that we had these experiences of being one with the universe, one with God, and that started our trip, started our journey. So that's the real meaning of lotus born. Anyway, so this kind of saint brings Tantric Buddhism to Tibet, and we know that the Indian tantras use psychedelic drugs extensively. So that's Buddhism. So it's quite a kind of like, quite, I think, compelling interpretation of the roots of Buddhism. Now, this is quite easy because Taoism, modern scholars accept, it's not controversial, that basically the common view is that it evolved from Siberian shamanism. So Taoism came from Siberian shamanism. It became Chuan in China, and it got imported to Japan and became Zen Buddhism. It became synthesized of Buddhism. Taoism meets Buddhism, becomes Chuan, becomes Zen. Now, the thing about Siberian shamanism is that the word shaman actually comes from that part of the world. So from southern Siberia, Manchuria, kind of Jurchen word called the shaman comes from southern Siberia. Now, the Manchurian shaman, they predominantly use fly agaric. So again, the idea that Taoism actually came from Siberian shamanism. Now, if we turn to the kind of Western or kind of more Oriental, kind of heading more westward now to the kind of like religions of the Levant and Middle East. Now Judaism, this is kind of probably obvious, but again, this is kind of stuff in Sunday school you're not taught, or is an interpretation your priest wouldn't approve of. Probably the earliest reference to psychedelic drugs, and also probably in the Bible, and also probably the first instance of drug prohibition, is the fruit at the center of the Garden of Eden. Now God said, don't eat from that fruit, because don't go there, God says. Now, but the serpent says something completely different. The serpent says, if you eat from the fruit at the center of the garden, your eyes will be opened and you'll become like God. So kind of like a plausible, very plausible psychedelic reference there, I'd say. Now, staying with the Bible, the Old Testament. Moses was a kind of Jewish lad who was adopted by an Egyptian princess. Now, the rabbinical traditions say that Moses was knowledgeable about all the Egyptian mysteries. He knew all mathematics, all kind of religion, philosophy, history of Egypt. Basically, a very clever guy. And so he would have known about the esoteric mysteries of Egypt, the lotus, the lily, etc. Now, Moses, when I first heard this idea that the burning bush in the Bible was basically a kind of psychedelic reference, I kind of dismissed it at first. But when you realize that when it happened, Moses was exiled because he killed a slave driver. And he went to Midian, and he actually married the daughter of Jethro. So Moses' father-in-law as Jethro. Okay, now in the Druze religion of today, in Israel, in Lebanon, in Syria, Jethro is the most revered figure. So Jethro is like a wisdom teacher, a kind of mystery religion wisdom teacher. Now the idea basically is that Moses learned more ancient mysteries from Jethro. An idea that the burning bush incident happened during his time in Midian. So it's the idea that basically the burning bush is some reference to a psychedelic plant, and that, you know, it burned, you inhaled the smoke, and you saw visions of God, and you got, you know, messages from the divine. So again, that's a kind of like, I think, plausible interpretation. Now, the most powerful, probably most really obvious reference to psychedelic plants in the Bible is the mysterious manna. Okay, the manna in the Bible is referenced all over the Old Testament and even Book of Revelation. Now what is the manna? Okay, the bread that fell from the sky, what does it mean? There's the kind of like movie version, the kind of Burt Lancaster, Charlton Heston movie version, kind of literally stuff falls from the sky and you know, the Israelites are hungry and they eat it. Okay, but the actual kind of, I guess, less allegorical meaning is more literal. The manna is a psychedelic substance. Now, how do we know that? Because in the book of Exodus, there's actually quite explicit descriptions of what manna is. It was white like coriander seed. In the book of Exodus, it looked like resin. It tasted of wafers made of honey. So you get this kind of like, you know, do you see the idea that the manna was some kind of psychedelic substance prepared in the same way that psychedelics are prepared today now? So probably honey to mask some bitter alkaloid taste, and, you know, white like coriander seed. That sounds kind of like I don't know, some kind of like cannabinoids, some kind of like maybe some kind of mushroom kind of thing. But again, the idea that the Israelites ate the manna in the Bible, they looked east and they felt the presence of Yahweh. So you eat this substance and you feel God. So again, in this context, you know, to a more progressive crowd, it's kind of like obvious that the manna is a kind of reference to a psychedelic substance used by the ancient Israelites. To conclude our survey of kind of religion as we normally understand it, Islam. Okay, this is probably where people think, what does that have to do with psychedelic drugs? Okay, most people are aware that there's severe prohibitions on alcohol in Islam. Okay, so basically no alcohol, not allowed. But some of you might be more aware that hashish is more tolerated. And historically, the Ismaili Hashashin sect, the assassins, used hashish for the kind of mystical rites. And in Sufism, historically and even today, the smoking of hashish and the ingestion of hashish is actually not common, but still used to induce states of being one with Allah. Now, why is this hashish thing such a, not accepted generally, but why is it more of a feature that's more tolerated in Islam? It's because of one hadith that Muhammad said. So one saying that's narrated by a reliable, trusted narrator, and it goes this. The apostle, okay, quote, the apostle of Allah said, okay, come with us to the house of Aisha, his favorite wife, Aisha. So we came with the prophet to the house of Aisha. He said to Aisha, Aisha, bring us food. She brought us hashisha, and we ate hashish. So that one hadith is why cannabis is more accepted in the Muslim world than other substances. So that could save your neck. If you're some place and you're about to receive 1,000 lashes for having possession of cannabis in a Muslim country, you can recite the hadith, and that might save your neck. It might save your skin, literally. Okay, so I mean, basically, that's the reason why. Now, okay, some of you might know if you eat hashish in large quantities, you eat it, not smoke it, eat it, that's probably more conducive to a mystical state. So you can see this idea of Muhammad's companions going to eat hashish is actually a kind of, you know, a very plausible interpretation of why he had these mystical states in the first place. And it's also a very plausible reason for why Aisha was his favorite wife. Okay, so jokes aside. Okay, so what happened then? What happened is basically, okay, so there's all this psychedelics in world history. I mean, it's pretty much ubiquitous, isn't it? We've gone through all the religions, we've gone through shamanism, all the Greek mysteries, all the kind of like antiquity. It's almost like Full House. And if you took out the psychedelic element, do you still have world religion? Well, no. If you took out the psychedelic element, do you still have world history? Probably not. So there's this idea that that psychedelics really propel the mind, they manifest the mind, and they kind of drive things forward. Now, to illustrate this idea, okay, the Beatles were a very good kind of rock and skiffle band. They were very amazingly good, okay. And then they met Bob Dylan in 1966, and he gave him hashisha, he gave him cannabis, basically. And then they became this kind of a very good band, and then had the album Revolver, okay. And in 1967, they started taking loads of LSD. Then you had Sgt. Pepper's. Do you see the progression? I'm saying that same progression with, say, the music of the Beatles and pop culture in general has had the same effect, these psychedelic substances, on world history overall. So I think that's a pretty compelling view of world history that probably you wouldn't be taught in any history course in university, but I think it's probably, if you take this factor out of world history, I think world history is radically not as interesting. It's basically, the Beatles as a very good pop skiffle band versus Sgt. Pepper's. Okay, let's do it that way. Okay. Anyway, so what happened? What happens is that if this psychedelic stuff is so ubiquitous and so powerful and so important, what happened is that over time it got banned. They suppressed it. They banned the heretics. They banned the cannabis fields. They banned, they suppressed the truth. Now, why is that? In Islam, in the 12th, 13th, 14th century, the Caliph, the Fatimid Caliph in Egypt basically systematically destroyed all the cannabis plants in Egypt and in the Levant because everyone's getting off their heads, and the Sufis were using too much cannabis, probably. And in the Christianity, the idea that the Eucharist. I missed out a section about Christianity. The idea that in Christianity, the Eucharist. Basically, that Christianity derived from Mithras. Okay, this is a section on how the psychedelic sacrament got banned in Christianity. Basically, we have Mithraeums where people worshipped Mithras and took psychedelic substances. Then, okay, so what happened to the psychedelic sacrament? Okay, so what happened is like the situation with Coca-Cola. The Coca-Cola used to contain cocaine. That's why it's called Coca-Cola. And at some point, people discovered it's really addictive and really too powerful, so they replaced cocaine with caffeine. So something very similar happened with the Christian Eucharist. The mysteries of Mithras had a full-blown psychedelic sacrament, but at some point it was replaced with alcohol. Then basically the mysteries of Mithras that the Roman soldiers were into becomes Christianity with lots of modifications, and it becomes essentially a great big tax collection system, and kind of they have Christianity as we see it today. So that's the roots of Christianity and the suppression of the truth in Christianity. Now we'll stay with Christianity because we're living in a kind of Christian Western country. Now, it's interesting because initially there was a banning of these kind of substances early on in Christianity, also a banning of Gnostic truths in the kind of early struggle of interpretation of what is Christianity in the kind of probably 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries. But even later on, the witch hunts that occurred with the Inquisition during medieval times. Now, what you taught in school was that these people went off, the Inquisition went off to persecute wicked witches, and they were burned. Okay, sure, it happened. There were cantankerous old women who people didn't like, and people wanted their property and their, and their houses, and basically they were accused of being wicked witches, and they were burned. But what it was really about, against this revised scholarship, is saying that basically the witch hunts were actually the Inquisition going out from the cities into the countryside and rooting out pagan mystery religion that had survived. Basically the use of psychedelic plants and substances in the countryside that survived the early kind of shake-ups in the Christian church. And that's what the Inquisitions and the witch hunts were really about. So the situation we have today in the West is this kind of really suppressed psychedelic suppression. LSD is more legal than murder. You can kill someone and you get less of a prison sentence than if you manufactured LSD, for Christ's sake. So basically it's really kind of banned in a severe degree. But we're going to show at the end of the talk why that's going to change in a dramatic fashion. So if these substances all over Zoroastrian religion, in Islam, tend to become suppressed, kind of marginalized, people use it secretly, then what happens is basically history trundles along, it becomes more pushed in the background. Esoteric mysteries become esoteric, they become hidden. So they become kind of like either banned, heretics burned, books burned, or else basically they exist in kind of these fringe marginal sects, fringe kind of like schools of thought, existing in these kind of like tiny sects within a religion. Now, okay, we're going to zoom the talk forwards to present times and the future now, but before we do that, we're going to actually reference kind of prophecies made thousands of years ago that talk about today. Now, prophecies specifically to do with psychedelic substances. Now, this sounds a bit probably new to a lot of people, but the book of Revelation, which is all about prophecy, contains references to the manna again. In the last book of the Bible, the book of Revelation, the manna returns. Okay, so this is prophecy for the future. Basically, the prophecy goes, it's about the second coming of Christ and it's kind of like the apocalypse at the end of time. To him that overcometh, I will give to him a portion of the hidden manna. To him that overcometh, I will give to him a dominion over all the nations. Okay, so basically a reference to the second coming of Christ, but the hidden manna returns. Okay, what does it mean? Why is the manna hidden? Why is the manna hidden? It's because the manna was kept, okay, as a kind of to remember ancient times in the Ark of the Covenant. That's in the book of Hebrews in the Bible. Now, okay, so why is the manna hidden? The manna is hidden because in 586 BC, when the Babylonians invaded Israel, the prophet Jeremiah, this is also in the Bible, hid the Ark of the Covenant. So the Ark of the Covenant is hidden along with the manna. So the hidden manna is hidden away, but somehow in the end times it comes back. Okay. The other major religion, Zoroastrianism, majorly influenced Judaism. Now, there's a prophecy made about 4,000 years ago. Okay, it goes like this. Saoshyant, who's the second coming of Zoroaster. Now Zoroaster, he's like one of the famous prophets, but there's actually a Zoroastrian more famous than Zoroaster. Now, who's that? It's Freddie Mercury, okay, of Queen. So you ask someone who's Zoroaster, they might say, oh, was he not the kind of the friend of the philosopher kind of Nietzsche, wasn't he? Some guy, philosopher guy. But if you say, who was Freddie Mercury? Of course, lead singer of Queen, then the person goes on to recite all the lyrics of Bohemian Rhapsody. But anyway, the prophecy goes, okay, the second coming of Zoroaster in the future, which is roughly now, I believe, is that, okay, the prophecy goes this. The Saoshyant prepares, okay, from the fat of a slaughtered ox, the hooma, okay, the hooma, again, that psychedelic substance. He prepares the hooma in the fat of a slaughtered ox, and he prepares the drink called hush. And it's given to all men and women, and they become immortal. So the psychedelic substance returns at end of time, and it has to be cooked in fat. So that's a kind of, I'd say that's a kind of reference to fat-soluble psychedelic alkaloid. Years ago, I was in a psychedelic chill-out room, and I was tripping my tits off on LSD. And this guy called Mushroom Mark had me a captive audience. And I was like, the room was spinning around, even without the spinning lights. I mean, my head was spinning around. As I had a captive audience, this guy was telling me how to prepare fly agaric. So wait, yeah, you hang the fly agaric on a radiator, and then the maggots come out, and then you do this, and you chop them up, and then you wait a few days. And then you have to cook the fly agaric in full fat milk way. It has to be full fat, because if you use skim milk, it doesn't work. Okay, so you see, you have to cook many of these psychedelic substances, including cannabis, in fat. So the fact that Saoshyant has to prepare the hooma in the fat of a slaughtered ox, can you see it's a kind of reference, I'd say, to a kind of like alkaloid, fat-soluble psychedelic substance. Okay, so now we're going to zoom forwards in time. These are prophecies for the end times, and we're living in pretty, I'd say, if something doesn't happen on this planet, then I don't think we've got that much longer left, in terms of end times. If the prophecies I'm not talking about now, then I'd say, when are they going to be, there's not much of a future if things don't happen. So I think the idea that the prophecies are now is very plausible. Now, 2012 has come and gone, but all the world's religions contain prophecies. And they all talk about roughly the same thing. Okay, it's like a storyline. And I won't go into it, I'll just skim over this. Basically, we are living in a time like no other. Okay, and all the things which make the world so unique, unprecedented, a planet in peril, not just a part of the world in peril, a planet in peril, the coming one world order, a universal decline in world religion, the technological singularity, and the apocalypse, the final revelation. Taken in composite form, all these prophecies from old world religions kind of paint a picture that kind of corresponds to the world today. Okay, so I just skimmed over that because that's another whole other kind of 1 hour, 2 hour talk. Okay, so the idea that prophecies are about now, and there's references in the prophecies to psychedelic substances. So we're going to zip forwards in time now. So antiquity. The rise and falls of civilizations. There was China, and there was Mongols, and there was Islam, and there was Renaissance and Enlightenment, and then we come to roughly now. So covered world history in about 10 seconds there. We're going to just slow down the accelerate the kind of progress in history. World War II. Nation will rise up against nation like no other time before, like the prophecy in the book of Revelation. Now, why is World War II so special? Because 4 things happen in World War II which are really special, and towards the end especially. What were they? Firstly, Albert Hofmann discovered the psychedelic effects of LSD in 1943, synthesized it in 1938. Now, why is that relevant? Because it's psychedelic. And also, Dan Merker, the historian, writes a book called The Mystery of Manna. He presents a very, not totally convincing, but a plausible case that the manna of the Bible is actually ergot. Now, if we understand that LSD was first synthesized from ergot, then the prophecy of the hidden manna returns in end time literally is the case. And psychedelic trance is massive in Israel. So literally, the hidden manna has literally returned 1943 with Albert Hofmann. Now, what's the other great happening? Of course, the atom bomb, horrible effects that we now have the capability to totally annihilate the world several times over now. And also, major happening, November 1945, the first von Neumann architecture, the ENIAC, the first programmable computer. Every single computer on this planet is a von Neumann architecture. In your phone, in your watch, in your internet, every single machine, computer on the planet is a von Neumann architecture. That basically, the very first seed happened in November 1945. We'll discuss more about the relevance of that when we talk about the technological singularity later on. The fourth massive event, December 1945. The Nag Hammadi Gnostic Gospels literally came out of the ground in Egypt. They're buried in an urn. So the Gnostic truths, which the Catholic Church and many kind of inquisitions in the past tried to suppress, were buried in an urn. And in 1945, of all times, they came back. And these Gnostic Gospels suddenly re-emerged. And the Gospel of Thomas, which people knew existed, but there was never found a copy of it. People knew it existed from other writings. For the first time, a complete copy was found. In it, Jesus says, whether you believe is literally a historical figure or kind of allegorical or mythical or part myth, part history. In it says, as I am, you can be also. Drink from my mouth and you shall be as I, and I shall be as you. And that kind of hidden gospel appeared 1945. So major happenings at the end of World War II. Now, zoom forwards. So Mkultra, the biggest joke in world history, that the hippie revolution was seeded by the CIA. Mkultra was a kind of research program to study the effects of psychedelic drugs as a chemical weapon, basically, and also for sabotaging world leaders. Now I tend to think kind of positively of things. Now, if people think, oh, that's a kind of historical accident, how ironic. The CIA seeded the hippie revolution and seeded the kind of counterculture. But no, seriously, when people get turned on, they want to turn other people on. The idea that there's a kind of rogue CIA cell that discovered this amazing substance and tripped out on these god trips, and suddenly they went, no, hey guys, we've got to trip people out. I think that's a very positive interpretation of what happened and plausible. But can I prove it? No, well, no, I can't. I'm just kind of, painting a kind of a pretty picture of what might have happened. But no, it's true. I mean, basically, people get turned on and they want to turn other people on. So the idea that the CIA turned people on in a kind of massive scale, turned Timothy Leary on, turned Ram Dass on, etc., is something that literally happened. I don't know exactly what went on in the minds of these people. Anyway, so this leads us to the modern period. So you had Woodstock, you had the hippie generation, the early 70s. You had Operation Julie, you had the kind of the 40th anniversary of the big drug bust in Wales 40 years ago. And you basically have the modern period. Burning Man, Glastonbury, kind of modern psychedelia, this kind of resurgent interest in progressive Eastern mysticism, Gnosticism, witchcraft. I mean, if you didn't have LSD, you wouldn't have that basically. If you didn't have ayahuasca, you probably wouldn't have many of the things that emerged from the 60s that came. You wouldn't have Steve Jobs. You wouldn't have a lot of the things that kind of came later on. So we kind of come to the modern period. And I think it's a very exciting time because right now we're living in a kind of resurgence of interest in psychedelia. So basically, there's lots more research going on in the world now, in America and the UK, especially on the use of psychedelics as a therapeutic substance. And also, if Forbes magazine, the kind of bastion of American capitalism, has written an article on psychedelic use in corporate R&D labs, that's a sign of the times. And also the idea that in Silicon Valley, the idea of microdosing, many people, progressive creative types in Silicon Valley are using LSD, probably inspired by Steve Jobs, in order to facilitate the careers and facilitate their computer programming. So there's kind of a resurgence going on in psychedelia right now. I think it goes hand in hand the Jeremy Corbyn, Bernie Sanders thing. I think, and I tend to think positively about these things. There's this kind of revolution going on in these kind of things. And we need to progress it. We need to basically feed it, basically. So that's why I'm kind of, why I do this talk in particular. But anyway, okay, so we come to present times. It's really exciting. Now we're going to shift a gear to talk about how psychedelics work. Okay, so we're going to complete shift the gear. We're in present times now. So with modern neuroscience, modern scientific understanding, how do psychedelics work? Okay, so how do psychedelics produce God trips? Okay, and why is it not illusory, but to experience things as they really are? So okay, this is a kind of a change of scene now. So basically gone from the historical to now the neuroscientific. Okay, now it works in two ways. Okay, the first way is kind of obvious. Okay, once you know the neuroscience. Okay, it's basically the idea that psychedelics hit certain receptors in the brain, and they activate certain receptors in the brain to do certain things. So I'll give you an example. The kind of cones in your eyes that detect color. Okay, they send fibers called a parvocellular fiber tract, and these fibers from the color detectors in your eyes end up in a layer of your visual cortex back here, called 4C beta. And layer 4C beta, taking the color projections from your eyes, is saturated with 5-HT2A receptors, which LSD and DMT bind onto and activate very powerfully. It's obvious, isn't it? Obvious. I mean, God, I was tripping one time in North London, and we were in pitch black walking along railway tracks, and then after many hours we came to a 7-Eleven. Then I came into the 7-Eleven and it was bright. Oh my God, the colors were more intense than any DMT experience I had. It was really bright. It was really intensely bright colors. Like, wow, this is colors as bright as I've ever seen. But obviously, the 5-HT2 receptors were potentiating my color pathway. So obvious. Okay, that's pretty obvious. Okay. The other thing is how LSD works. This is probably quite obvious as well. Now, the way your brain works, basically, it's hierarchical. So your primary visual cortex projects to your secondary visual cortex, to your tertiary visual cortex, to your quadrenary, up to your language centers and your emotion centers. Okay, so if you imagine that direction of flow is bottom up flow of information. Okay, and you have opposite top-down flow of information from your language centers to your visual centers. Now, okay, they project in certain ways. So from your eyes, the inputs go to a certain layer of cortex, your brain sheet, your brain mass, your cerebral cortex. And the bottom-up pathway goes to a certain layer, and it projects in a certain kind of way to layer 4, going from 2 to 3 to layer 4 again. Now, the top-down pathway, okay, also has a very specific way of projecting. Now, top-down means you go from language or abstraction to the more concrete. So if bottom-up means, basic visual input into language, then bottom-up, top-down means language to, primary sensory primitives. Now, the top-down pathway starts from layer 5 into layer 1, 5 into layer 1, etc. Now, the interesting thing is that from layer 1, the top-down pathway, there's a thing called a apical dendrite, which takes the signal from layer 1 to all the neurons and all the other layers. So the top-down pathway ends up in layer 1. Now, the apical dendrite, okay, that takes the information from layer 1, is saturated with 5-HT2A receptors again. So you see, the top-down pathway is boosted by LSD and DMT. So you see what's happening? When someone's hypnotized, okay, if you tell that person, you see a pink elephant over there. Now, someone who's hypnotized, their primary visual cortex will light up, and presumably they're seeing a pink elephant, and a person who isn't hypnotized won't see that pink elephant. Now, on LSD, if you probably had this experience, you kind of tripping on LSD, you open the fridge, and the noise of the fridge motor becomes the most amazing music you've ever heard, most amazing trance music you've ever heard. But you know it's not there, it's just the sound of the fridge motor. But it's amazing, you just listen to this amazing music for ages, and you think, wow, God, that's angelic music I'm listening to. And also, years ago in St Albans, I was kind of like, on an LSD trip, and I was walking around the lakes, and there's some kind of old ruins. Okay, so it's probably set and setting made me think certain things. Anyway, the mist on the lake early in the morning became knights and ladies, really intricate, really detailed. I could see that, like every detail of their faces, every detail of their chainmail armor and stuff, because of the ancient ruins. That basically is like a hallucination. It's my top-down pathway projecting from my language centers. I see ancient ruins. Therefore, I'm projecting into my visual field these knights and ladies, intricate details of these things on the experience of being on LSD. Can you see? So that's quite obvious explanation of how these psychedelic drugs are working on one level. Now, how do psychedelic drugs produce the God trip? Now, here's where it gets kind of, I guess, more kind of hard to explain, because how can the finite brain generate the infinite? So it's easy to see how, kind of color pathway can be boosted, a top-down pathway can be boosted, but how can the brain generate the infinite? Surely it's illusory. Okay, so how does it work? We need to explain that it's not illusory, and then we need to explain how it works. Okay, so these are basically the major neuroscience paths in the brain. Okay, so there's the major chemicals that work your brain, basically. And the interesting thing is that all the psychedelics activate these pathways in different ways. So noradrenaline, mescaline activates the noradrenaline pathway. Dopamine, apomorphine, the lotus plant activates dopamine. Acetylcholine, we talked about that earlier, the witch's weeds, and fly agaric activate and kind of mess up the acetylcholine pathway. And serotonin, classic psilocybin, LSD, DMT, activate serotonin. Now, the thing is, basically all these psychedelic substances produce God trips. They produce states of being one of the universe. But at the same time, they're all different pathways. So what's going on? Now, it's not a simple case that, cause and effect. I, activate this pathway, therefore the colors become brighter. I activate this pathway, therefore, the God trip happens this pathway. Because they all activate differently. Different substances all activate these pathways in different ways. And they're completely different. They project to different places and use different receptors. Now, the common, what all these pathways have in common is that they spread from a tiny cluster of neurons, and they basically spread out throughout the entire brain. So what they have in common is basically they have a massive effect on the entire brain. The idea I am proposing is that basically the reason why these psychedelic substances produce these states of transcendence is not through cause and effect, it's rather that they're working by shutting something down. So the idea that if you cleanse the doors of perception, then you see the infinite. It's not that these drugs are producing the infinite. Basically, the infinite is your default state. That somehow your default state is being kind of held down by fear and desire, the kind of mechanisms of your brain which are do with homeostasis, survival, reproduction, etc. That's the kind of samsara, that's the human condition. But somehow in certain kind of mystical states or spiritual practices or under influence of certain psychedelic drugs that influence these pathways, that influence the entire brain, you close something down. So therefore, the state of being one of the universe or one of God is not being produced from the brain, but it's actually to return back to your default state. And the experience of being, the entheogenic state is not one of, I'm in a peculiar state of mind. It's actually the most familiar state there is. It's like a coming home, the return to the source. So this idea that basically it's not that these substances and the brain is producing consciousness and it's not producing the God state. It's basically the God state is default, and that our embodiment reduces the infinite state to the finite state. And by short-circuiting the kind of fear and desire circuits, you release the infinite state. So now I need to explain probably the hardest part of the talk. I need to explain why it is now that this idea that we're all one consciousness is actually the truth. And I'll do this in a very interesting way, because I'm going to show, because this is the last kind of section of the talk, I guess. I mean, it's we've covered a lot of ground. I mean, there's kind of spiritual techniques of trying to get mystic states, of kind of paths of contraction, paths of expansion, where you kind of emaciate yourself, you starve yourself for 40 days in the desert, and somehow you might get a mystic state with a bit of help, from a girl giving you some milky substance. So these are paths of contraction, and there's paths of expansion, these kind of like mystical journeys, etc. We won't go into too much of that today, because it's kind of intricate, and it's not kind of, it's one of those things you can't really go into superficially. Okay, so What we will go into, basically, we're going to show why modern science, okay, why modern science, okay, why is that modern science, okay, why cutting edge science in the world today is actually leading back towards sacred truths. It's actually the return of the ancient mysteries. And why it is that all these ideas, which are really the most cutting edge ideas in science today, set up the conditions to explain how we're all one consciousness. Okay, so this is the kind of final segment, well, apart from the conclusion, this is the kind of, to explain now how it is that everyone's God, and how when we experience being one consciousness or being infinite consciousness, it's not illusory, it's actually the way things really are, and that science is leading back towards that truth, inevitably. Okay, so this is the real apocalypse, this is the unveiling of the hidden thing, and it's the inevitable progression of science. Now, okay, the idea that the universe is illusory, Maya, Sanyata in the kind of in the spiritual traditions, that reality is illusory. It's something kind of like that quantum physics has really kind of supported this idea in a massive kind of way. Now, sometimes materialists and militant atheists especially say that people misappropriate quantum mechanics in order to justify woo, spirituality and idealism. But the fact of the matter is, the originators of quantum mechanics, they were all idealists because they were from the German-speaking tradition, without exception, including Einstein. And also the fact that Schrödinger, his waves, actually the kind of bedrock of quantum mechanics, actually said in the 1961 interview, he was influenced by the Hindu formulation, the all in the one and the one in the all, when he was formulating his wave equations. So the idea that basically at the heart of quantum mechanics is the idea of an illusory universe. John Wheeler, who worked with Albert Einstein, said according to quantum mechanics, there's no out there. So there's this real kind of battle of ideas going on in the world right now. The physicalists, the materialists are clinging on to this thing called parallel universes. That's the only way to save, this idea of a physical universe out there, independent of conscious observation. So, but the simple answer is basically that the universe is simply illusory, which is a complete return to ancient mystical ideas. Okay, so the second one is, related, is Max Tegmark, who's an MIT physicist. He has reintroduced the idea of a mathematical universe, that a physical universe, again, it relates to the idea of an illusory universe. It doesn't really exist, it exists as a mathematical object. He actually quotes in one of his early writings, Pythagoras, who said that the universe is a number. So this is a kind of ancient sage, essentially a cult leader, brought the Greek mysteries from Egypt to Greece. So this idea that the universe is illusory and behind it is a mathematical object. We're going to explore this a lot more in a few minutes because we're going to explain how a single mathematical object can actually generate the universe. The other thing that's really come about in the past less than 5-10 years is this idea of a purposeful universe. Now, there's no reason why the universe is not purposeful. There's a kind of backlash against religion. Oh, prophecies, kind of second coming of Christ appearing in the sky, kind of thing, dispensationalism. So kind of many scientists kind of did away with meaning and purpose in the universe. But Paul Davies, who's a very respected physicist, actually in a recent conference actually says we need to put back, maybe that's the key to understand the universe, put back the idea of meaning and purpose into the universe. Now, okay, this is really interesting, like a revolution. This thing called time-symmetric quantum mechanics has existed for decades. The mathematics is beautiful. Okay, but it's sat there for decades because people didn't have a use for it. Now, there's a kind of very weak experimental support for this idea now, and the guy who originated it 40 years ago won a major prize in America, was awarded a medal by Obama. So it's suddenly come back to the fore. And kind of many physicists now, kind of hard-nosed, even materialist physicists, kind of militant atheist physicists, are talking about a destiny wave function emanating from the future back in time, somehow pulling the universe back to a kind of pre-configured state. So that's cutting-edge science. It sounds mystical. It sounds religious, doesn't it? Well, it is, because it's convergence back to religious ideas. And another idea that's very new, it comes from string theory and also loop quantum mechanics. Okay, loop quantum gravity, another kind of way of unifying all physics. Basically, the idea is basically the Big Bang. It's not the beginning anymore. So the Big Bang is actually the Big Bounce. And the fact that there's a pre-Big Bang epoch. Okay, to cut a long story short, okay, both string theory and loop quantum gravity says that the pre-Big Bang epoch is actually a mirror reflection of this universe. And there's a thing in physics called CPT symmetry. If you reverse any of these symmetries, you have to reverse all the others. It's basically charge, polarity, and time. So polarity is mirror reflection. If you reflect the universe in a mirror, automatically you inverse time. What does it mean? It means that the Big Bang is a time inversion. It means if the Big Bang is not the beginning of the universe, is actually the big bounce, it means that we are bouncing back to the origin. So what is the beginning? Then what is the universe heading towards? It's basically extrapolation of what's happening on this planet. That life has become as one, the universe has become Gaia, it's becoming one world order, the world is becoming as one. Whether it's a global tyranny and whether it's going to be a kind of more just, equitable world society, that's the great big issue right now we're facing. Anyway, it's a simple extrapolation of that to the universe. And that's basically the return of an ancient idea that the body of God becomes a universe and the universe becomes the body of God again. Very ancient Hindu idea. The other one is the idea of a fractal universe. The idea these are fractals. Basically, fractal forms self-similar. So basically the parts reflect the whole. So you see a Russian doll, classic Russian dolls, a great big Russian doll. See that the Russian dolls reflect the bigger Russian doll. You see these shapes, these are all fractal. The parts reflect the whole. The basic idea is that the universe is one great big fractal. Okay, this is a simulation of the universe, and that's a mouse neuron. So this idea of the kind of brains and the universe somehow reflecting, that's actually a depiction of this is not a computer generated simulation. This is actually measurements of basically galaxies. So basically this is where our galaxy is, okay, our entire galaxy is that point. And all these specks are entire galaxies. And the scientists are saying that this is one tiny branch of an even bigger tree, a bigger fractal. And this is actually 600 billion light years across. That's huge, isn't it? And our galaxy is a tiny speck within that speck. Okay, so the idea that basically this fractal branching tendril thing is actually a part of a bigger tree, the entire universe becomes eventually one big fractal. Okay, now if we tie this together with, so we're going like a skimming stone over these subjects. Okay, this other idea of the universe as a giant brain, this is a very old idea that somehow intelligence is woven into the universe. Now, a paper came out in 2012 in Nature magazine, most prestigious science magazine in the world, that said computer simulations of the entire universe actually had the same dynamics as computer networks and also as neural networks. So on a cosmic scale, the interactions of the universe reflect networks in the brain. Okay, so these are kind of very cutting-edge thoughts. Now, what is it leading towards? What's it leading towards? It's leading towards the idea of the fractal brain theory, that the brain is a fractal, and that the fractal of the brain reflects the fractal of the universe. Because this is a whole other talk, 2-hour talk, but there's talks on YouTube. Just look up my name, fractal brain theory, and have explained how the entire brain is a single fractal. Okay, one single fractal hierarchical object. Now, the basic idea is basically that the brain fractal reflects the fractal of the universe perfectly. So if you kind of combine all these ideas of a fractal universe, the universe as a brain, the fractal brain, and then basically, it's basically the idea that the entire universe is one huge brain and that we decipher the nature of the universe from understanding our brains and minds. But is this the complete return of the ancient ideas of somehow there's a transcendent image and a cosmic image, and somehow we're made in that image? You might want to call it the image of God. In Upanishads, which are Hindu texts written 5,000 years ago, as is the human body, so is the cosmic body. As is the human mind, so is the cosmic mind. As is the microcosm, so is the macrocosm. And as is the atom, so is the universe. And what are they talking about? They're talking about fractals. So you see how it fits together? Basically, these cutting-edge science all fit together into a kind of a sacred cosmology of a fractal brain reflecting the fractal universe. So we're somehow living that fractal cosmic image in our lives. Okay, so this is a very, I think, compelling picture of the universe using the latest cutting-edge, ideas in science, coupled with a cutting-edge fractal brain theory, at least a fractal artificial intelligence. We'll talk more about in the end of the talk. Okay, so now why does that explain that we're all one consciousness? Okay, this is quite bold and dramatic. This is quite grand and cosmic. Okay, but how does that explain that we're all one consciousness? How does it explain that we're a God? Okay, you're saying that we're a reflection of the universe, so we're this tiny speck and we reflect the universe. That's great. Okay, but how does it show that we are actually the universe? Okay, this is the trick. This is the 21st century trick that science has set up to reveal. Okay, I'll do it now. Okay, this mystery that has been hidden for years and years and years, centuries and millennia, can now be finally explained, and it's basically a direct result, an inevitable outcome of these most cutting-edge ideas in science. So how does it work? Okay, so look, you know your own consciousness. So you're looking at me now in this room listening, I'm looking at you, consciousness, first person subjective experience. That's all you've ever known. That's all you can ever know. Your one consciousness. Okay, so basically you've only ever known one consciousness, and you've never been outside of your consciousness. You can never get outside your consciousness. So how do we go from there to explain that we're all one consciousness? Okay, there's an idea in philosophy and also in artificial intelligence called organizational invariance. It simply means, I know I'm conscious, I know you're conscious. Okay, unless I'm a psychopath, then I recognize that you're conscious, and also recognize that you're like me. Your brains are like mine. You live lives like mine. Your structure of your brain is like mine. So organizational invariance, therefore I can assume that you're conscious and also your consciousness is like mine. Okay, let's introduce another simple idea. Scale-Invariant organizational invariance. It just means that if I have a brain that's the size of a planet, the size of a galaxy, the size of the universe, just because it's bigger than mine, I can assume basically if it's conscious, because it's organized like mine, then it actually shares the same kind of consciousness. That's a reasonable assumption, isn't it? It's a tiny step in reasoning. Basically, it's a tiny leap of faith, if you like, but it's reasonable. Okay. Now, if the universe is one great big fractal that reflects my brain, your brain, it means that we can reduce all existence to the same kind of consciousness. Okay. Because you know your consciousness and you know the structure of the brain. But if that structure of the brain extrapolates the entire universe, then okay, this is a stepping stone. We've actually can see faintly that if the universe is conscious, that it somehow reflects our consciousness. Okay, so okay, that's the next step is how do we reduce it to one consciousness? Okay, we go back to our mathematical universe thingy. We need an equation. We need a mathematical equation that describes not just this universe, but every single universe that can possibly exist. We need to kind of formulate or conceptualize a mathematical equation that contains all possible existence. Now, how do we do that? We have, because through analogy, through metaphor, we have a thing called a Mandelbrot set, and it's basically an object. It's a fractal object. It's basically the equation is so incredibly simple, and that's the equation for the Mandelbrot set. Okay, it's a recursive equation. Now it's simple, but it's iterated thousands and millions of times. Okay, but what it generates is infinite variety. So basically, the Mandelbrot set generates, okay, that's an overall Mandelbrot set. And you can zoom in on it, so you can zoom in on parts. It contains infinite variety. You've seen these in rave parties, you've probably seen them in math books and kind of magazines. Now to show you an animation, to show you the true beauty of the Mandelbrot set, that simple equation, okay, this is a fly-through, and so it's basically a simple view of a tiny aspect of the Mandelbrot set. Now basically, okay, this is basically contained in an equation. So basically, a mathematical equation contains this infinity of pattern and beauty. And it's never repeating. Basically, it's infinite. It goes on and on. It's contained as a mathematical equation. The simple proposal is that there's an equation called the Logos. It's called the equation of the universe. It's more complex than a Mandelbrot set, but it's also a fractal equation. And basically, it represents pattern more complex than that because it represents and it actually encodes the entire universe from beginning to end. Well, not just this universe from beginning to end, but every single possible universe from beginning to end. And that's basically in the Bible as the Logos, which is from Pythagoras, kind of lineage of ideas. Now, the proposal is that you know that your brain is conscious, that you have this consciousness associated with your brain. Okay, now how do we reduce everything to one consciousness? Now, this is the shocking idea, is that the entire universe is fractal reflecting your brain, and that the one consciousness that is God, the undivided one consciousness, is using this Logos, using this equation of the universe to generate first-person subjective experience. And then when the illusion stops through psychedelic drugs or through mystical practices, you become the Logos. You're no longer this person in this body, in this planet, looking out on this vast universe. You become the universe, which is the equation that encapsulates, encodes the universe. So we kind of experience ourselves as a tiny part in the all, but when the illusion stops, we become the all and the part. Now, okay, there's another idea in esoteric religion which is universal. Okay, in Freemasonry, Rosicrucianism, Rastafarianism, Druidism, Hinduism, Buddhism, mystical Islam, Judaism, Kabbalah, it's absolutely universal. And that idea is reincarnation. In Christianity, basically also Christianity, in early Christianity, that's what the Gnostics believed. The people who believed in Mithras. It's an absolutely universal mystical idea. Now, how does this allow us then to explain that we're all one consciousness? Now, back to our Russian dolls. Okay. So back to our Russian dolls. We're going to, basically, if that's the universe, and that also, there's a fractal brain theory which shows that the brain is like a Russian doll arrangement. And then basically the universe contains all the Russian dolls, and all life forms and all people and all entities in the universe are one great big Russian doll. What it means is that if we take a cosmic Russian doll that contains every sentient being from beginning to end, this is a simple schematic. Basically, that Russian doll, if that's a universe, and that's every single sentient being from beginning to end nested in Russian dolls, cosmic consciousnesses, galactic consciousnesses, planetary consciousnesses, to kind of like human consciousnesses, then basically the idea is basically you can take that Russian doll and you can chain all those Russian dolls onto a single chain of transmigration, which is reincarnation. Now, this is the shocking idea that combines all the ideas of esoteric religion with these cutting-edge scientific ideas. Now, this is truly shocking because it means that basically this is the path of transmigration of the one soul, undivided individual consciousness of God. And this is why God is always one, undivided and individual. And this is why consciousness, that we are always one, undivided and individual. And this is why at any point on this chain, any of these Russian dolls, cosmic, galactic, cosmic, the entire universe, universal, Vishnu, celestial Buddha, at any point in this chain, the Russian doll can experience itself as being the totality of all existence. And it's not illusory, it's actually experiencing things as they really are. So at each point, basically, the one consciousness is taking the logos, this mathematical equation that contains all possible universes, and it's generating subjective experience along a long chain. And each of those Russian dolls, if you can imagine that's a lifetime, that breaks up and unravels to a chain of experience from your beginning to end. All your days of your life chained as Russian dolls on a long chain. Can you see? So basically, the entire fabric of the entire universe, everything that's ever happened, the entire physical universe from beginning to end is actually woven as one single continuous thread, and it's a very long thread. It's a very long string. The fabric of the universe, the kind of the fabric of reality, the expression of eternity is one single continuous unbroken thread. And what it means is that this journey of God is basically what you're experiencing right now. Now, people at first it seems incongruous to say, someone claiming to be God, like a Jesus or a saint or a prophet claiming to have experience being one of the universe or one with God. And people think, my God, look, the universe is huge. You know how big the universe is? That this speck on this planet claims to have been the universe. It's simply because there's two kinds of huge. There's physical, spatial huge, XYZ huge. That's huge. The universe is really huge. But there's another kind of huge, which is to do with time. That eternity really is a very, very long time. And you think it's going to take ages to string out all these sentient beings on this chain, but it doesn't matter. You've got the time as the eternal one soul to do it. So this is a radical way of looking at reality, but it's exactly what the prophets and all the founders of religion have been talking about. It's exactly what you experience on psychedelic drugs when you have the God trip. So you can see with your rational mind, with the most cutting leading edge currents in science and mathematics and fractal brain theories and fractal genome theories and studies in consciousness, basically what was said is completely wild and probably counterintuitive, but it's completely reasonable. So can you see, finally, for the 21st century, the hidden truth can become fully revealed. So your rational mind, not just your experiential LSD mind, but your rational mind can actually apprehend the truth, as well as your kind of psychedelic entheogenic mind, and they converge, and then actually, encourage one another. Okay, so just to conclude, where does this lead? What's the conclusion? What's the future of all this? It means that with this idea, we end up with the long-awaited paradigm shift. This is not a paradigm shift, a total shift in consciousness, a shift in a way of looking at the universe, which is where all these cutting-edge currents in science are converging anyway. And it's really, people talk about this paradigm shift, but no one can quite articulate it. But I'm saying it comes about through these cutting-edge currents in science. Okay, the really kind of quite exciting, compelling claim is that when we say apocalypse, the unveiling of the hidden thing, the historical apocalypse, the esoteric religion, the hidden religion, esoteric means hidden, the hidden religion, and the God in the gaps, the gap that science has not yet explained. When all these aspects of science are revealed, then the God in the gaps is the complete return of the hidden mysteries. It's the complete return of the hidden religion, and it's the unveiling of the hidden thing. Okay, so that's kind of like an apocalypse of ideas. Now there's another kind of apocalypse which this paradigm shift leads to, and it's the technological singularity. So basically, this back to ENIAC, the von Neumann computers, and it's happening in the world now. But basically, the technological singularity is this transformation of the world that's so dramatic that even it's called apocalypticism for nerds. So basically, in people commentating on this technological singularity, they call it apocalypticism for nerds. Now, what is it? It means that basically, you know that basically technology seems to be accelerating. Okay, mobile phones come out every single week now. New chips come out practically every single day. You know, you read about some new chip coming out. Technology really is accelerating. And the technological singularity is the point. Okay, this is all the stuff happening in the world in the next 50 years, next 40, 50 years. All the things that are kind of, population growth, all this kind of stuff, all the kind of stuff we want going down. But it's this thing called a technological singularity. And it's basically this idea that when artificial intelligence finally arrives, we finally understand the brain to create this artificial intelligence. It creates this technological explosion where in a short space of time, you have technology more advanced than Star Trek. That's the idea. But can you see, it's so dramatic. It's been called an apocalypticism for nerds. It's literally a new earth. And if we combine that with the paradigm shift, which is effectively a new heaven, which is the original heaven, which is within, then we have a kind of like a really full-blown apocalypse and real transformation that will happen in our lifetimes, in the next 10, 20 years, I predict. So the future of psychedelic drugs in general is that it happens within the context of these bigger changes. It means that basically any psychedelic technology you can imagine, it will happen. Any way of manipulating your brains, your neurons, nanotechnologies, ways to recover your brain, repair your brain, fix your brain, etc., they'll come about in the next 10, 20 years. So basically, in terms of psychedelic technologies, I mean, you can go on and on. Anything you imagine will probably, could be invented. And but what's really important is the paradigm shift that really causes changes in legislation and changes in norms. But also, once you revive these mystical ideas and revive this way of looking at reality, there's huge implications because political ideas of equality, liberty, fraternity, meritocracy, ideas of human dignity, ideas of kind of progressiveness, of sanctity of human life, they rest on certain metaphysical assumptions. And it's not selfish genes, it's not materialism, it's not humans as meat machines. It's basically the idea that somehow God is inside us, that ultimately we are divine. So the implication politically and also socially of this paradigm shift are immense. And it's not just to have the freedom to use psychedelic drugs without being thrown in prison, but it's a complete transformation of how people look at the world, the universe, themselves, and politics, and the whole shebang, coupled with the technological singularity. So that, my friends, is the future of psychedelic drugs, and this Gnostic idea is going to come full force in the next, 5, 10, 20 years. And that's a good place to end the talk. Anyway, thanks very much. that's a marathon session. Wow, no, thanks a lot. That's actually, normally we do a break in the middle of the talk, but because we kind of plow right through, we thought there's going to be time limits.